So the Warmaster of the 41st Millennium is reborn for 10th edition, and he's brought massive rerolls and the ability to rustle up command points directly from the Dark Gods. Let's take a look at the datasheet for Abaddon the Despoiler in 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos once more, and I thought that seeing as we've had the datasheet for Abaddon the Despoiler revealed to us, I thought we'd take a bit more of a focused look at it, go through the ways that it's changed and how he might play in 10th edition. I think his role will have changed really quite a bit, though he still looks decently powerful at the right points cost. For those of you who aren't aware of who this guy is, he's basically the Warmaster of Chaos, and perhaps one of the most principal antagonists of the 41st Millennium's galaxy. Commander-in-Chief of the Black Crusades and the architect of the fall of Cadia, smashing the planet with his Blackstone Fortress and unleashing the Cicatrix Maledictum across the galaxy. This guy's basically a demigod level threat, blessed by the 4 Chaos deities, and fighting with Horus's old wargear and his Demon Blade Dracnian. The current miniature from Games Workshop is £42.50, €55 or $70. Not exactly the biggest miniature for the price that you pay for it, but at least in-game his points cost generally tends to be fairly on the high side, so it's not the worst value in terms of points fielded. At least in general, the miniature has been very well received by fans. It replaced a truly ancient model of Abaddon that just wasn't really living up to his reputation, and I think that this one really does capture him quite well. Resplendent General of Chaos, and casually stomping a Primaris Marine's body into the ground. You might potentially be able to find him just a little bit cheaper recently due to starring in that Boarding Patrol box set for Chaos Space Marines. That was a discount box that he was in that was rather good. It did sell out pretty fast from Games Workshop though you might find some online. If you were looking to add the Warmaster to your collection, he's available at Element Games in the UK for 15% off Games Workshop prices, £36.14, and at a small discount in the USA through Noble Knight Games for $64 rather than $70. Both of those are linked in the video description, and if you do pick up any miniatures through either of those, it does help to support the channel. In 9th edition, Abaddon really did receive a massive glow up in the latest Chaos Space Marine Codex, perhaps one of the most apex models for crazy amounts of special rules all layered on characters. He had enormous melee with Dracnian or the Talon of Horus for anti-tank or anti-horde. With his rerolls active, he was pretty capable of one-rounding something like an Imperial Knight in combat without really breaking a sweat. He gave out massive rerolls, particularly to Black Legion, with rerolls to hit and to wound, though perhaps the most standout thing about him was just how ridiculously hard he was to kill. He could be right in the face of your opponent's army and they could still have trouble. A 4+ invul with toughness 6 and 9 wounds helped, but then it also negates one failed save a turn with Tzeentch, turned down the rolls that he could be wounded on with Nurgle quite a bit, and most importantly had one of those damage cap phases where you couldn't take more than 3 wounds in any single phase for the game. That just makes him really hard to deal with on a character protective model. It is just a little bit weird to think that you could basically have infinite shooting damage in a turn and still not be able to kill him. Multi-phase damage was generally needed to try and bring him down. Overall, currently he is very powerful, 350 points, but still seems to be a very popular choice including in Black Legion lists. Moving on to his 10th rules, however, and Games Workshop showed off this datasheet in a recent Chaos Space Marine faction preview. Lots and lots of very helpful details, and we basically know how he's going to play, though we don't know his points cost yet, so we're not really going to be able to relatively weigh him up against other things yet. That'll have to be done when the points come out. Otherwise, for things for fielding him, it looks like he doesn't have any Black Legion keyword, along with Heretic Astartes in the bottom right hand corner there. Judging by what we know about epic heroes so far, that probably means that he won't be locking you out of taking other Chaos characters, things like Lucius the Eternal or Huron Blackheart, who are Legion locked, though it does appear at least from this that there's nothing special to particularly indicate that he's going to be taken as some sort of supreme commander for the Chaos Super faction anymore. I'd guess he's probably just going to be Chaos Space Marines from now on. It was a bit unusual to see him wandering around with a whole back of Imperial Knight War Dogs, as wasn't particularly uncommon throughout 9th. For his basic stats, Abaddon moves 5 inches, a little bit slower than before. I guess maybe that's to keep him in line with standard Terminators now. Will just mean that he's a little bit harder to reach his prey though, I suppose. He's got a leadership of 5+, so we'll be taking battle shock 1/6 of the time on average. Still maybe surprisingly high for a Chaos Supreme Commander. Seems like just about nothing in the game is going to be ignoring this these days. It does mean that he's going to be at least pretty reliable with the Dark Pacts though. His objective control 4 as well, basically enough to hold his own against a few standard infantry, but he isn't going to be adding a crazy amount of objectives, not compared with entire squads. For other more basic keywords and things on his datasheets, looks like he remains infantry, while Rebute Gulliman remains a monster. That will be quite nice for keeping him working quite well with terrain and being able to move around and through it. It still looks like he retains all the different Chaos Deity keywords as well, Slanesh, Nurgle, Khorne and Tzeentch. And from what we know about the Slaves to Darkness detachment for the Chaos Space Marines, it looks like that's going to be helping out with some stratagems, and potentially the core rules for it as well. He gets Deep Strike for teleport deployment if you want to. There's not been anything to make us doubt that that's still going to be the 9-inch deployment away from the enemy, likely still on turn 2 and turn 3. That will make it a bit of a long charge, to be honest. I feel like most of the time people are probably still going to want to start him on the board. He's also got the leader keyword too, so unlike Rabute Gilliman, he isn't going to be wandering around as his own single agent. We've yet to see exactly what squads he can lead so far, but my guess is that it's probably going to be Terminators. He is in Terminator armor after all, and that's exactly what he'd be leading in the lore. Not impossible that they could make things a bit more flexible for him though, and allow him to join Legionaries or something. We've only had a few previews as to what squads certain leaders can join so far, so we don't really know exactly how lenient or strict Games Workshop's going to be with it. It does kind of mean though that if you're buying in Abaddon the Despoiler, you'd have to budget for a squad of bodyguards for him as well. I don't think his defensive profile is going to be good enough to allow him just to be running around on his own, and he doesn't seem to get lone operative either to shield him from the worst excesses of enemy fire. Next up, that brings us to his toughness. I'd arguably say that this is probably the biggest nerf from 9th edition currently. His buffs and his melee damage still seem good, but his durability looks like it's gone way down. He's still certainly not super easy to kill. Toughness 5, a 2+ save, 9 wounds and a 4+ invul, basically equivalent to 3 of the new Terminator profiles strapped together. I'm kind of surprised that he didn't have something like toughness 6 though, given that Gilliman had a toughness of 9. I guess again maybe the toughness profile is to keep him in line with squads that he can join, like Terminators perhaps, so perhaps that's the logic there. Compared with previously though, he has lost a pip of toughness, he's not got any wound roll debuff or ignoring a hit debuff, at least on his datasheet, though I guess it's not impossible that the Slaves to Darkness detachment might add those back in. We've yet to see the main rule for that. He definitely looks like he's lost that phase damage cap though, so if he is exposed at the front of the army, he's probably going to get a lot of damage. Perhaps not the worst to see the back of that. It was a little bit weird and arbitrary, I thought. It does look like it's going to be fairly dependent on durable guards to keep him alive though. For his damage profile, at range he strikes with the Talon of Horus, 4 shots at 24 inches, hitting on 2s, a strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2, basically a heavy bolted profile there, and he gets sustained hits 1 for extra hits on 6s. Useful enough to have, and I guess he'll be able to plink a few enemy infantry with that. It does look like this might actually be biggest for his Dark Destiny rule though, for farming up some command points. In combat, as suspected, his stats are far more exciting. Either you get to choose to attack with Dracnian, which is 8 attacks at strength 14, AP 4 and damage 3. Pretty huge whether you're fighting against elite infantry or vehicles there, and it gets devastating wounds as well with the chance to convert some damage to mortals. Otherwise he can strike with the Talon, which puts him up to 14 attacks, so not quite double there, and they're all made at strength 7, AP 3 and damage 1. Pretty solid at chewing through thick armour for a sweep attack there, maybe particularly good for killing things like Sisters of Battle I suppose. Overall I'd say that his melee damage is still very decent indeed, kills around about 10 Termagants with the sweep mode, about 6 Space Marine Intercessors or 2 or 3 Terminators, and averages at around about 13 wounds to a toughness 9 to toughness 13 vehicles, though that would go down a bit if they had invuls. Looks like in terms of melee damage he'll add a whole ton to his squad if he is fighting alongside some Terminators. Certainly looks like he could be carrying them a bit in terms of combat damage. Finally though on his datasheet, and perhaps 2 of the most exciting bits, are his 2 different special rules, both of which are nice. His Dark Destiny rule is a way of rustling up command points. Basically this one works that every single time you take the Dark Pact roll, and roll against his leadership for a damage buff with a chance to take some mortal wounds, if that test is passed, then you rustle up a command point on a 2+. This seems pretty great considering how precious command points are these days. If you only get 10, then potentially having a shot at 5 more is awesome. The Dark Pacts can both be used in shooting and in fighting. Maybe one of the biggest questions that we have for this rule though is whether or not there's still a turn cap on how many command points you can regenerate. I guess in theory in a battle round he could be regenerating 3 different command points there, 1 for shooting with the Talon, and then 1 for fighting both in your turn and the opponent's turn if things work out for him. I feel like it's unlikely that Games Workshop's going to allow that kind of thing to happen. My guess is that it will probably be limited to just regenerating 1 command point, regardless of source that it comes from. Still though, whether or not it's de-restricted like this, it looks like it's really quite powerful and not that hard to trigger. The Talon of Horus looks like it could be actually pretty useful for triggering that, shoot it off in the shooting phase, and then make a Dark Pact to give it some lethal hits. That'll generate you a command point at a small risk of some mortal wounds for Abaddon, and depending on the final wording of characters joining units and things, you might even be able to shoot with some of the Terminator weapons to trigger it, rather than Abaddon himself. Overall, I feel like this is probably worth triggering as many times as you can. With a leadership of 5, he's only going to be taking the mortal wounds on a 17% chance, so if you rolled with the Talon of Horus all game long, you'd farm 3 or 4 command points over the course of the game on average, with the failure chance for taking an average of just less than 2 mortal wounds over the whole game. Overall, that seems a very favourable trade to me. Well worth it, and the damage might not even matter all that much if he's safe within a unit. Having a chip wound or 2 on the character isn't the end of the world if he's going to be safe behind Terminators. Overall, looks like a really solid rule, and I feel like it's going to add a fair bit to the army just literally for this. His other major rule basically represents his command abilities though, and this is the Warmaster. While Guilliman might not normally have auras, it looks like Abaddon still keeps them in force. In your command phase you get to choose one of 3 different ones, either a damage buff, a defensive buff, or a leadership and battle shock buff. I'd probably rate the damage buff as the best out of the 3. Paragon of Hate looks particularly good for Chaos Space Marines in particular. It's a 6-inch aura of any Heretic Astartes, getting 4 rerolls to hit. If you're hitting on a 3+, that's normally going to be a plus 33% damage boost. Pretty potent. Looks like it applies to Abaddon himself equally as well, though I guess you'd just be rerolling the ones there. And there's no indication that it doesn't apply to some really big vehicles as well. He could be potentially buffing a trio of Forge Fiends or something, or some scary Dreadnoughts. Looks like he's going to be a really solid model to castle around. What's more though is that this stacks amazingly with the Dark Pacts and the lethal hits that you can get on any unit with that. If 6 is to hit auto wound, then it means that you can just reroll everything that isn't a 6. If it makes sense to, you can just fish for more auto wounds. Should mean that even lighter guns should be able to punch up really efficiently against tanks and stuff. Provided you've actually got some meaningful damage dealers with line of sight about, then I'd say that this is well worth it to go for most of the time. Otherwise, we've got his Mark of Chaos Ascendant, which is the defensive buff. This one's interesting, and it gives you a 4+ invul save to any infantry or mounted units within 6 inches of him. Mounted, I'm believing, will probably mean both bikes and cavalry. Presuming the Chaos Space Marine Terminators have the same rules as the Loyalists, you'd already have a 4+ invul save on those, so I guess it might be less relevant for them. Seems strong though for things like regular Chaos Marines with just a standard 3+, and at least so far there's nothing to imply that Cultists couldn't get that. Cultists with a 4+ invul save do seem pretty obnoxious to remove. Not sure if that'd necessarily be worth building around over and above the big damage rerolls that he can get, but maybe seems like an interesting one to flex into if you don't have a good damage target or you don't think that you're going to need the full rerolls. If you can't attack with the nearby units, you may as well brace in to weather the storm in return. Finally, we have the Morale and Battle Shock buff, which I think is probably the weakest of them. You get to reroll leadership and battle shock tests for nearby units. Definitely helpful enough, but I think that your regular Chaos Space Marine units they'll be passing normally anyway on a 6+, and I don't think it's really worth it just to avoid a couple of mortal wounds from Dark Pacts here and there. I'd much rather have the massive damage buff on the unit and maybe double down on fishing for those lethal hits, except just a little bit of mortal wound damage. I'd say maybe this could be most relevant if just literally you need to make sure that your unit doesn't get battle shocked and lose an objective at a key time, maybe at the very end of the game. Or maybe if your opponent's army does something that's absolutely horrendous with battle shock. If they've got enormous great big debuffs and you really need to make sure you don't fail, maybe this could be a good counterplay option. Still though, I'd default to big damage rerolls most of the time. Otherwise, from the Chaos previews and 40k in general, we do know a few things that he might be able to synergize with. First and foremost, the Dark Pacts when used on himself, quite apart from generating him command points, will help with damage. He will be able to trigger them a bit more reliably with that 5+ leadership, though it will be quite painful if you're taking mortal wounds on him, as he's a pretty valuable model. The lethal hits one seems like it's probably the way to go against toughness 14 vehicles, particularly if you've got the full rerolls on the go and it makes sense to fish for the auto wounds. Otherwise, just gaining sustained hits is no small damage buff when he's got that many quality attacks. Exploding hits on 6s with Dracnian or the Talon will give him an extra 20% damage typically. As I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty keen to find out what the Slaves to Darkness detachment rule is. It sounds like it's some sort of way of dedicating different Chaos units to different gods and getting buffs for it. As Abaddon looks like he's going to be dedicated to all the gods, it might well be that he still has all the buffs on the go at the same time. If that is the case, it could make him massively better in that detachment, as well as the option of having boosted stratagem access. Talking of which, from the one stratagem that we've had previewed, that's Dark Obscuration. Gives the model stealth and also can't be shot at greater than 12 inches away if you've got a Mark of Nurgle. Again, this one's going to be kind of interesting to see how it applies with named characters giving their buffs to squads and maybe sharing keywords. I guess if he has the Nurgle keyword, it would probably confer to the whole unit. It sounds like it would have the potential of making Abaddon and the big unit of Terminators unable to be shot at greater than 12-inch range, which seems pretty horrendous to have to deal with. If that does work out after we've seen the fine print, that seems like it could potentially be a very strong way to play him. Otherwise, for previous stratagems, I guess you could make use of Rapid Ingress. That's the one to drop him down via Deep Strike on your opponent's turn, and then hopefully set up for a charge the turn after. Could be interesting enough Deep Strike shenanigans though, but I can't help but think that you're probably going to want to start him on the board. Those big rerolls right from the get-go seem just a bit painful to pass up when he could be helping out your shooting units early game. You'd basically be committing to using that stratagem as well, which does cost a CP, otherwise he'll be making a 9-inch charge and probably failing it. Otherwise, I guess the option for delivering him might be a Land Raider. We've already seen the Assault Ramp rule courtesy of the Space Marine datasheet. Looks like he'd be threatening a charge all the way out to 20 inches on average, which is pretty mad. Again, depending on how much cost that is, and whether or not he can use things like his command buffs while embarked, it could be another nice way to get him up the board far earlier. I guess he probably will be able to choose that command buff when he's embarked. It's kind of similar to the Angron rule at the moment that he is allowed to pick when he's off the board. Could be good news if you're putting him inside a big spiky transport. Overall, obviously it's very early days at the moment without full rules out, but generally Abaddon I think is looking really quite strong. A lot of value for him just alone looks like it's locked up in big full rerolls plus rustling up command points all game long. Both of those will be worth just a lot of points even if he was absolutely terrible in melee, and of course he does have a big combat threat to add to a squad too. I guess biggest questions from here are how much his points costs. That'll allow us to weigh him up against other characters, what the rules for the Terminator squad are, as you're likely going to be taking one of those alongside him, and perhaps most interestingly, how he'll benefit from Slaves to Darkness. There should be other stratagems that key off his various god keywords, so he could be a great unit to use those on. Otherwise, in terms of gameplay, I'd probably start him on the board as opposed to deep striking, gets those rerolls and that command point generation right from turn 1, and aim to keep his gun or his squad's gun firing, and try and keep the command points flowing with those dark pacts. I guess that might give you a bit of a tricky question as to whether or not you want to advance each turn though, as getting him towards melee will also be pretty important. I'd say it's probably going to be best with a big durable squad of Terminators slogging towards the midboard, probably followed up by a few shooting Chaos Space Marine units to nose into his aura and get big damage from it, a bit of an advancing castle to wrest one section of the board from the enemy. In particular, that Nurgle stratagem looks amazing to protect him while he goes there. If it really does proxy to the entire unit via his keywords, then that's going to be nasty. Just looks like a horrendous thing to be dealing with a gun line if you can't even shoot him unless you're super close to that scary melee profile. Overall, looks pretty fun I think. Let me know your thoughts on the Despoiler down in the comments below. How do you think he's going to fare in 10th edition compared with his 9th edition datasheet now? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's how I can afford to keep on making quite so many videos quite so often. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.